Dad looked me dead in the eye and said, "Go ahead. Walk away. You wouldn't last a week without this family." So I did the only thing he never expected. I dropped the keys to the house he paid for right on the counter and walked out. No yelling, no tears, just the sound of metal hitting marble and his face cracking for the first time in my life. By morning, my phone lit up like a burning fuse, my mother sobbing, his boss demanding answers, and now the bank calling nonstop asking, "What exactly did you push him into doing?" Funny how the moment I finally left was the moment their entire world began to fall apart. My name is Everett Kestrel, and this is the story of what really happened when I finally stopped being the son who stayed silent. Before I share my story, I want to know you are here with me. Just say listening in the comments or tell me where you are. I love hearing how far my story reach. Sometimes even the smallest connection can make a story feel heard. Thank you. And now, here's my story. If my voice resonates with you, hit subscribe. It helps more than you know, and it reminds me that someone out there is listening. Rain had already started when I pulled up to Aldercrest, the driveway slick and reflecting the halo of the entry lights. I remember the portrait First Lydia Harrow's face looming in the foyer, stern and small mouth, the one everyone pretended didn't matter until they needed to point at legacy. The house smelled like oak polish and lemon. Servers moved like clockwork. Silverware sang against plates. Cassian stood at the head of the table with that practiced smile, the one that could charm a bank and freeze a room. He welcomed everyone, praised Damon for vision and relationships, and the compliments piled up like towels in a closet until they drowned out the work I'd done for 10 years. The late nights, the spreadsheets, the models that had kept this empire from tipping. I had the CPA license on the wall of my office and the overtime burned into my shoulders. On paper, I balanced the books. In practice, I balanced my father's narrative. When he announced Damon's promotion, his hand settled on my brother's shoulder the way a gavel settles a courtroom. He didn't so much as glance at me. Then, with the casual cruelty he reserved for private theatrics, Cassian looked straight at me and said, "Go ahead. Walk away. You wouldn't last a week without this family." The room inhaled with him. Some people coughed polite laughter. Cousin Jennifer, shifted her phone and angled it so the chandelier caught light on the case, probably streaming before she even realized. My mother's eyes flicked to mine, pleading and starched with habit. Damon shrugged, leaning into the grin he had learned to wear when credit needed borrowing. For years, I had been the foundation no one saw. That night, I decided foundations don't have to stay buried. I set the keys down one by one: penthouse key, the car fob, the elevator badge, the parking pass, each landing a clean, small sound against the marble counter. The metal clicked, the room stilled, and for the first time, the face that had always been untouched showed a crack. I didn't beg. I didn't argue. I walked out into the rain while the phone in my pocket began to vibrate like a warning. The engine hummed. Jennifer's camera blinked at the screen of the family's private channel. I drove until the city melted into a smear of wet lights, and when I stopped, my phone was a small furnace of missed calls and messages. I had a stash, years of small bonuses and side gigs that no one counted, and a plan only in the sense that I had files, copies, and a decision. I'd left something else behind too, a live feed that within minutes of my leaving was forwarded, where I could never have predicted Harold Maddox, the chair, and an internal address at First Meridian Trust. My action had intended to free me. In under an hour, it had made everyone else look up. I checked into Harbor Light with cash, no trace on my company card, and pushed the door closed against the smell of stale coffee and bleach. The room was the size of a closet, but it held my things and my laptop and the first honest silence I'd had in years. I set out the printed spreadsheets, the emails I'd photocopied in the dead hours, the little things I'd tucked into a manila folder for a future I hadn't known would arrive so soon. I wasn't some rash child of privilege. I'd been consolidating anomalies for months. Riverside's unaccounted 50 million odd wire descriptions, approvals that stopped at a name and never followed a signature. I opened the file I had feared and hoped to find the trust ledgers. Then Milo called. Cassian just pushed a purge, he said, voice tight over the line. He asked, "IT to scrub traces tied to you. But listen, there's an unmapped cluster in subsidiary servers. Backups. No one's indexed it." I told him to walk me through it. He did slow and careful, and I felt my chest unclench the first real time that night. I logged into the backup with credentials Milo slipped to me off hours, and I found page 12. The line read like a guillotine loan agreement, $200,000 collateral Harrow Legacy Trust. My fingers went numb. Lydia's terms were clear, and the original trust assets could not be used as collateral. This was a breach in bold ink and dirty intention. I photographed the page, scanned it, encrypted every copy, and began tagging evidence loan docs wire transfers that sliced across jurisdictions, authorizations with signatures that didn't sit right when I compared stroke pressure and loops to the handwriting I knew. While I worked, Ilara Voss called on the line, and I almost laughed and cried at once. "I've been watching," she said. "Your grandmother left instructions and a lawyer's promise. Come to North Star tomorrow morning." She told me Lydia had placed an extra set of documents in a safe deposit with the bank and had appointed counsel should her beneficiary ever need intervention. I uploaded the files to 3 separate clouds and split keys for the encryption because Cassian would react, and because Milo had just told me he'd found deletion logs commands issued from the executive console with Cassian's user ID stamped on them. I started to breathe faster. Part of me wanted to go back to Aldercrease and fix everything with an apology. Part of me knew apologies are for people who can be trusted, not to repeat the harm. Then I found the transfer file, Atlantic Partners, $50,000, authorized by D. Kestrel. The signature matched the tilt and flourish of Damon's, not perfectly, but enough to tie. I uploaded sealed and sent copies to Ilara through a channel she'd specified. As the upload completed, my laptop pinged an automated system notification sent from corporate file accessed from IP 144.xxxxxxx. It landed in Cassian's inbox as surely as if I had walked across the carpet and thrown the documents on his desk. He saw me move. Whatever I had started was no longer private. The motel light hummed. Outside, rain kept scoring the windows. Inside, my phone began to ring again. The North Star lobby smelled of coffee and winter wool, a different kind of quiet from the motel's fluorescent sleep. Ilara met me at the glass doors with a folder thicker than I expected, and a look that folded pity and purpose together. We sat beneath the city's gray morning, and she introduced me to the small team they had assembled: 2 forensic accountants, a trust litigator, an associate who lived on subpoenas. She did not ask why I was there. She already knew every why. In a white vault room under a bank employee's watchful eyes, Ilara slid the safe deposit drawer open and produced an envelope addressed in a hand I recognized before I saw the name, "For Everett, open when needed." My throat tightened as she unfolded Lydia's letter. It was 3 pages, not the dry legalese I'd feared, but careful instructions and a notation that read like a command if trustee actions breach the trust. The beneficiary may petition for immediate independent oversight. There was a notarized amendment tucked beneath the letter, stamped and signed calligraphy that left no argument primary beneficiary with emergency authority to require a co-trustee. The room tasted like copper. Ilara read aloud passages while the accountants cross-referenced files I had sent the $200 million loan, the Atlantic transfer signatures that started to look like a family map of theft. She laid out a path: prepare an emergency petition, get a watch placed on the trust assets, time the motion to land when the merger vote moved into view. "Your grandmother anticipated manipulation," Ilara said. "She left us an out. But to use it, we must act decisively." I felt a strange steadiness, as if a mantle in my chest had clicked into place. Then my phone vibrated with one call that turned the steady cold to heat. Cassian. He knew. The bank's notification system had, in compliance, pinged him as a listed beneficiary. "You're trespassing on family," he said, voice thin as wire, but the threat in it was the familiar machine. "You'll regret this. I will have you arrested if you touch corporate files." I listened while he painted me as a blackmailer, as an unhinged son. My mother called after, voice frayed. "What have you pushed him into doing?" Her words lodged heavy, a physical thing. Ilara watched me fold Lydia's letter back into its envelope and said, "This was deliberate. Your grandmother did not trust the documents would remain safe inside the family. She dispatched copies to an external counsel in London, an ethical vault. If Cassian locks the servers, we still have a route. She hesitated then, and added something that made the air prick among the records. There was a recurring signature that neither Lydia nor anyone in our family recognized, H. Morgan, appearing in routing instructions for offshore transfers. That signature changes the shape of this, she said. It implies an outside hand. Milo sent me a short clip of the IT logs commands issued to delete access timestamps matched to the executive console. He whispered that someone had tried to scrub nearly everything tied to my account, proof that Cassian was already digging his heels in. The choice lay bare: move now and risk the family's fury, or wait and let him close the doors forever. I stayed quiet for a long time with Lydia's handwriting under my thumb, feeling both the weight of accusation and the certainty of permission. We packed the evidence into 3 sealed folders, encrypted and duplicated, and Ilara told me what to expect. The bank could file an emergency freeze. The board would be notified. Press would be a certainty. I left Northstar with the sense that a second Colder War had just been declared. I left Seattle by red-eye and began tracing the money in places where people thought no one cared to look. In Portland, a former accountant met me in a diner that smelled of grease and burned coffee. He slid a thin manila across the table with the kind of caution that felt like contraband. The ledger printout showed a $50 million transfer to Atlantic Partners and an account number opened 3 days before the merger announcement. He told me Damon had been signing invoices labeled consulting that never matched any work performed. The money moved within hours to intermediary accounts tied to casino chains. I recorded his voice on my phone, careful and soft. Los Angeles was hotter and louder. The bar where Damon used to close deals smelled like spilled liquor and ambition. A partner he'd used for introductions, too slick to be caught in court but willing enough for a late-night conversation, told me Damon created shell contracts, sent the invoices to headquarters, and routed payments through Cayman entities for plausible deniability. He named a man, Braddock, who ran high-stakes games and kept ledgers for people who forgot they were gambling with other people's capital. I took the name down and felt it land like an accusation. Austin was quieter. A half-built development sat with steel ribs reaching skyward, frozen in permit limbo. A project manager showed me the paper trail funds released, contractors contracted, then money diverted to a merchant account that vanished before a final invoice could be paid. Someone had emptied the pipeline. I photographed the abandoned plans, the stamped approvals, the memos with initials that matched the forged signature I had now seen 3 times. Each place added threads to a map I began to draw on the motel wall in marker lines, between Damon and Atlantic Partners, between Braddock and a bank in the Bahamas, between shell companies and our own ledgers. At a late hour in LA, I felt a shadow at the edge of the bar's parking lot, a car idling, headlights dim. I slowed and found a silhouette that melted away when I lifted my phone. The presence was no coincidence. I called Ilara, read the newest connections into the line, and she told me to courier a sealed copy of everything to Northstar, to not email, not to trust. She warned that Cassian's people were already constructing a narrative for the board, that I was unstable, that I had accessed files unlawfully, that any motion I made would be tainted by motive. I met a man in Portland who said, "You're playing with fuel you don't want lit," and he was right. I was burning through family ballast to reach truth. Then in a rented storage unit in Austin, beneath a stack of dusty blueprints, I found a folded sheet. Lydia had once annotated a handwritten risk analysis in her precise, cramped script, noting anomalies in loans and a warning about using trust assets as collateral. Her notes felt like a tether from the past to the present, proof she had suspected manipulation and had left breadcrumbs for someone who cared enough to read them. There was a page stamped with a date 2 years prior, and an approving signature that matched Cassian's hand, precisely authorizing a significant loan against the trust. He had signed it himself. I held that paper, and the motel's thin walls became a room of glass. The deeper I dug, the more the family's architecture showed as built on compromises and secret doors. I sent the most damning documents to Ilara by hand, wrapped in brown envelopes, and drove back north with a map of culpability in my mind. Somewhere between toll booths and coffee stops, Cassian's name landed in my inbox again, a terse legal threat, and a terse PR statement drafted by his counsel accusing me of unauthorized access and warning shareholders of destabilizing action. The message was meant to frighten me into silence. Instead, it set the clock on a plan we had already started to move. The flight back into Seattle felt heavier than the luggage I carried. By the time I stepped off the escalator, my phone buzzed with a corporate memo forwarded by 3 different colleagues. Cassian had instructed HR to classify my absence as mandatory mental health leave, and to alert department heads that I was not authorized to access sensitive workspaces until further notice. The words were clinical, sanitized, but I could hear his cadence in every sentence. By the time I walked into the lobby of Kestrel Dynasty Group, the air had already shifted. People glanced, then glanced away as if I carried a contagion. Legal blocked my badge at the executive floor. An assistant I'd mentored for 4 years wouldn't meet my eyes. When Grant Maddox summoned me into his private office, it was the first time all morning someone spoke to me like a person rather than a risk report. He didn't ask for evidence, only asked, "Are the rumors about fund misuse true?" I told him I couldn't disclose details yet, but I confirmed there were violations that endangered both the trust and the company. He exhaled slowly and warned me Cassian had already started briefing select board members with a version of events where I was unstable, vindictive, and acting out of personal resentment. "Be careful," he said. "He's prepping a narrative." At Northstar, Ilara handed me a packet containing something new, a signature H. Morgan repeated across multiple offshore routing slips. No one at Kestrel carried that name. No vendor, no counsel, no board member. It existed only in transactions that drained the Harrow Trust. She said it once more, so I wouldn't miss the implication someone outside the family was being used as a financial veil. While we discussed this, I slipped away briefly to meet a quiet man from internal audit at a coffee shop near the tower. He arrived jittery, clutching a folder under his jacket. He told me Cassian had maintained a secondary finance channel for years, what he called the shadow office, where sensitive approvals were handled through encrypted emails that bypassed the official servers. He slid over a thumb drive containing a cached folder he'd risked his job to copy. Inside it were consulting invoices that matched Damon's travel schedule and linked to transactions routed through Braddock's network, then washed through Dubai intermediaries before disappearing into Caribbean institutions. Not long after, Ilara called to warn me the merger vote had been accelerated 2 days, not a week. If Cassian succeeded in closing the deal, the trust assets pledged as collateral would vanish into contractual obligations, nearly impossible to unwind. I spent the next hours gathering hidden files from the shadow office, drawing the most complete timeline I'd ever assembled, connecting transfers, forged approvals, and offshore entities into a single narrative map. I stayed out of Kestrel's internal systems entirely. The walls had ears now, and every step in that building was being logged for ammunition. By late afternoon, the pattern sharpened, the signature H. Morgan wasn't a person at all. It belonged to Harrow Morgan Holdings, a protective shell Lydia had formed decades ago to safeguard assets from hostile actors. Cassian had repurposed her shield into a siphon. The realization felt like being punched and steadied at the same time. The internal auditor confessed something else. Years ago, an anonymous file had been sent to Northstar outlining discrepancies. Northstar suspected it came from Lydia herself before her health declined. She had been fighting the corrosion long before I even recognized its existence. Then at the end of the day, Cassian struck his boldest blow. An all-company email blasted across every inbox accusing me of stealing confidential documents, threatening the stability of the organization, and engaging in unethical behavior unbecoming of an officer. My face was now a corporate cautionary tale. But as my phone lit up with messages concerned, confused, angry, I realized Cassian had made a fatal error. His public condemnation was retaliation, and retaliation was evidence. I forwarded the email to Ilara. "He just handed us motive and obstruction," she said. "Use it." And I intended to. Northstar's conference room became a command center, binders, transcripts, diagrams of flowcharts that looked more like escape routes than financial structures. Ilara reviewed everything I had brought from the road and told me quietly but firmly that delay was no longer an option. If Cassian sensed the full scope of our findings, he would destroy whatever remained of the original records. I left Northstar to retrieve something Lydia had hinted at in her letter. Returning to the penthouse felt like stepping into a version of my life preserved in glass. I went straight to the top shelf of the bookcase, to a battered notebook Lydia had once gifted me. Inside was a mechanical pencil I had never used. When I twisted it open, the barrel broke into 2 pieces, revealing a micro USB tucked inside like a message in a bone. I drove back to Northstar and watched as an analyst plugged it in. What appeared on the screen was a list of 10 offshore accounts in jurisdictions known for secrecy: Bahamas, Cayman, Luxembourg. Each entry carried a tag K. Damon or K. Cassian. One entry carried my name Everett tied to an account opened 2 years earlier, and I knew instantly that my identity had been used as camouflage. Along with the account list was a grainy audio file. Lydia's voice filled the room, steady, aware, describing how Cassian had begun shifting trust assets out of her reach while she was still alive. She said she feared he planned to empty the structure before her estate attorneys could intervene. The sound of her voice cracked something in me I hadn't realized was still intact. Hours later, I slipped into the sub-level archive beneath Kestrel's headquarters. The security door looked untouched at first, but closer inspection showed fresh pry marks on the latch. Inside, a single document lay on the floor. When I lifted it, I recognized Cassian's signature, beside the name Harrow Morgan Holdings, another proof he had impersonated the protective entity Lydia had built. My phone buzzed sharply, Milo's voice tight on the line. Cassian had ordered the deletion of Damon's email history going back 5 years. Milo managed to save the deletion log before the purge completed, but not the content itself. "They're erasing the trail," he said. "You need to move." With the USB's data integrated into the financial map we'd built, the picture was complete unauthorized transfers, backdoor accounts, false consulting contracts, trust collateralization, offshore laundering, shell identities. We assembled the package for the board, clean, chronological, impossible to refute. I called Grant Maddox, told him Northstar would attend the merger meeting, and he agreed without hesitation. "Bring the truth," he said. "Let the room see what it has tolerated." But the night had one more fracture left. Milo texted that my credentials had been fully blocked despite no formal termination. Damon's location app pinged once near the airport before disappearing. Minutes later, a voicemail came through, his voice frantic, words slurring into panic. "You don't get it, Everett. I'm not the only one. This goes further. You're in over your head." The message ended abruptly, swallowed by static. Meanwhile, Ilara discovered a newly drafted contract hidden in the USB backup directory, an agreement prepared for signing on the same day as the merger. It transferred control of the Harrow Trust to an overseas financial entity, effectively removing all jurisdictional protection and stripping Northstar of its authority to intervene. If Cassian executed that transfer, the trust would be beyond recovery. I stood in the darkened Northstar office while the city lights pooled across the glass, the weight of Lydia's voice, Damon's message, Milo's warnings, and Cassian's ambition all converging into one inevitable fact: the boardroom would be a battlefield. And for the first time since the night Cassian told me to walk away, I felt ready to walk in. The elevator ride to the 60th floor felt like a countdown. When the doors opened, the boardroom was already filled, members murmuring in tight clusters, legal staff stationed outside like sentries, the long table polished to a reflective shine. Cassian sat at the far end, rigid jaw locked, a stack of papers in front of him that I recognized even from a distance, his curated version of the truth. Ilara walked beside me, steady as stone, and the room fell into a muted hush as we entered, with Northstar's representatives carrying binders. I set my heavy case on the table. A few board members exchanged glances. Others looked away, unwilling to commit their expressions to any side yet. Cassian began before Grant could call the meeting to order. He lifted his memo and declared I was a destabilizing force, claiming I'd stolen documents, falsified accusations, and attempted to sabotage the merger. His voice was sharp enough to slice through the room. He demanded the board strip me of whatever residual authority I held. I asked for permission to address the board before any motion was made. Grant granted it immediately. Cassian's nostrils flared. Ilara stood first. She laid out the financial trail with precision: the $200 million loan collateralized by the Harrow Trust, the $50 million transfer to Atlantic Partners, the offshore cycles routing through Cayman, and the ledger of accounts recovered from Lydia's USB. When she projected the image of the signature used to authorize several of the transactions, H. Morgan Holdings, the room reacted audibly. Grant leaned forward, tapping the table. This was Lydia's protective shell, he said quietly. How did it end up in your approvals, Cassian? I stepped in with the logs showing deletion commands made from Cassian's credentials during the exact window after I walked out of Aldercrez. Then the projector displayed the transactions synchronized with Damon's travel dates. Cassian clenched his fists under the table. He had sworn repeatedly that Damon's involvement was limited to minor administrative tasks. The evidence contradicted him mercilessly. I played the recording of Lydia's voice. The silence that followed felt like winter settling across the room, her calm explanation that Cassian had already begun shifting assets without authorization, that she worried the trust would be emptied before protections could activate. I laid down the printed proof of an account opened under my name without my knowledge. That detail hit harder than any chart. Several board members recoiled visibly. Northstar's lead counsel rose and announced that trustee rights had been formally suspended. You could feel the air shift Cassian's power base tilting out from under him. My phone buzzed once. A text from my mother asking me to stop saying I was tearing the family apart. I scanned the room, swallowed the ache, and kept going. Then Grant motioned to an assistant who slid forward an email. He explained that earlier that morning the board received an anonymous message sent by Damon before he vanished, stating someone besides our father was involved. A few people exchanged uneasy glances. When Cassian tried to reclaim momentum, he produced a contract claiming he'd been granted temporary authority by H. Morgan Holdings to act on behalf of the trust. Ilara flatly pointed out the signature didn't match the real entity's authenticated signatory file. The lie sagged in the space between us. Northstar followed with an announcement the merger was officially frozen. The room erupted in voices: concern, disbelief, panic. Before Grant restored order, Cassian stood, voice cracking with fury, and shouted that if they removed him, every man and woman at this table would fall with me. He said everyone present had benefited indirectly from Harrow funds, whether they knew it or not. A tremor passed through the room. Even those who disliked him shifted uncomfortably. The tension rose like pressure building beneath steel. I felt my pulse against my ribs steady only because I knew the next vote would rewrite the empire he'd built on borrowed foundations. Grant called for a recess. The boardroom emptied into side hallways while lawyers swarmed around binders and notes. I stayed seated until Cassian approached. His voice dropped low, stripped of performance. He told me to stop the proceedings, told me this was my chance to protect the family name, to walk away before the damage was irreversible. He spoke as if appealing to loyalty could undo years of erasure. I told him plainly that preserving the family name had never been the issue, preserving its integrity was. He stepped back like the words had weight. When everyone reconvened, Grant announced the conclusion of the legal review. The findings were sufficient to justify immediate removal. He read the resolution. Cassian was to be dismissed as CEO for ethical violations, financial misconduct, and breach of fiduciary duty. The vote passed. No amount of persuasion or threats could stop it now. Legal escorted Cassian out as he glared at me with a mixture of disbelief and a father's wounded pride. For a second, I felt the ache of that look. Then it hardened into clarity. Damon's role was addressed next. His messages, financial trail, and missing status left the board no option. He was suspended indefinitely, and all relevant documents were turned over to federal investigators. The voicemail he'd left, his panic, his admission that he wasn't the only one, played through the room. It confirmed what Lydia already knew: the structure was rotted from more than one angle. Northstar's representatives then stood and formally appointed me as co-trustee. My voice didn't waver when I accepted the responsibility. I refused the board's offer to consider me for CEO. I had no intention of inheriting a throne built on coercion. Instead, I announced I would found my own firm focused on forensic financial recovery and corporate restructuring. Grant asked if I would consider contracting with Kestrel Dynasty Group to repair their internal controls. I said yes under my terms. Later that day at Northstar, I signed the documents ending Cassian's authority. I turned over every offshore account report to federal authorities. When it was done, I left the building with a strange mixture of grief and liberation. My new apartment near Lake Union was modest compared to Aldercrez, but felt more like home than anything funded by the Kestrel name. I unpacked Lydia's framed letter and hung it by the window. Her handwriting reminded me that the battle had begun long before I joined it. News arrived over the next days. Damon had crossed the border into Vancouver and was officially wanted. Cassian was placed in a non-operational advisory role, all decisions monitored, future charges pending. The Harrow Trust regained more than $180 million. The board began implementing reforms, and I began drafting my firm's first full-scale rebuilding plan. One evening, while sorting through my old boxes, I found another audio file stored on a forgotten backup card. Lydia's voice filled the room again, gentle, resolute. She said that if I was hearing this, then I had survived the first war, but the story wasn't finished. She suspected someone else inside the company, someone whose influence ran deeper than Cassian's, someone connected to the origins of H. Morgan Holdings. She said she hoped I'd never need that knowledge, but she doubted the world would be that kind. I sat by the window afterward, looking out across Lake Union. The water moved in quiet ripples, unbothered by the weight of dynasties. I knew the fight wasn't over, not entirely. But I finally understood that I didn't need a family empire to define me. What mattered now was what I chose to build, not what I inherited or dismantled. And for the first time in my life, I felt entirely, undeniably free. When the sun finally slipped behind the skyline and the apartment dimmed into soft blue, I let myself breathe in a way I hadn't in years. Not the shallow, measured breath you take when you're trying to hold everything together, but the kind that fills your chest, expands into your ribs, and makes you realize just how long you'd been living in survival mode. The battles, the boardrooms, the betrayals, they were all real, all scarring, but somehow they no longer felt like weights chained to my ankles. They felt like markers of a life I refused to let someone else write for me. I thought about Lydia, the woman who saw the danger long before any of us understood it. She didn't leave me wealth. She didn't leave me power. She left me clarity. And that clarity, more than anything, became the compass that guided me out of a legacy built on control and into a future I could finally claim as mine. What surprised me most wasn't the money recovered, or the titles shifted, or the scandals that made headlines. It was the quiet truth I discovered in the aftermath. Courage doesn't roar in grand gestures. Sometimes it's as small as saying no. Sometimes it's walking away with nothing but your own name in your pocket. Sometimes it's standing in a room full of people who doubt you, and speaking anyway. If you'd asked me months ago whether I believed I could stand against my own family, against generations of silence and inherited obedience, I would have laughed, or lied. But the truth is, we don't grow from the places that feel safe. We grow from the fractures, from the nights when we barely sleep, from the moments when everything we thought was permanent begins to crumble and we're forced to ask, who am I without the things I cling to? This story, my story, isn't just about financial misconduct or legal battles. It's about claiming the right to your own future even when the people who raised you try to convince you that you don't deserve it. It's about choosing honesty over comfort, integrity over inheritance, and freedom over approval. And maybe if you're listening, there's a part of you that understands that feeling. Maybe you've been dismissed, underestimated, told you were lucky to be tolerated. Maybe you've stayed quiet to keep the peace even when the silence cost you more than you ever admitted. I don't know your story, but if you've made it this far into mine, then something in it echoed inside you. And I want you to know something I wish someone had told me sooner. You are allowed to walk away from anything that asks you to shrink. You are allowed to choose a life where your worth isn't measured by your usefulness to others. You are allowed to rebuild even if you must burn the old foundation down first. Before I close this chapter, I want to ask you something simple, something small but meaningful to me. If you're still here listening to the end of my story, let me know you're here. Drop a hi in the comments or tell me where you're watching from. I read every message. Knowing that someone out there understands or even just hears me makes all of this feel a little less lonely. And if my journey meant something to you, if it gave you strength, inspiration, or even a moment of clarity, I hope you'll subscribe. Not for numbers, not for vanity, but because I want to keep telling stories that remind people they aren't powerless, they aren't invisible, and they're not walking through their battles alone. Thank you for staying with me. Thank you for listening. And wherever you are, whatever you're fighting, may you find the courage to choose yourself even when the world tells you not to.